All right, welcome to the next lesson. We're going to talk about in this lesson the context of governance policy so you can see where they actually fit in the organization. And then secondly, I'm going to give you that template that I mentioned in an earlier lesson so you actually be able to see the nitty-gritty detail that should be in your governance policy manual. So the first thing we want to do is to understand that governance policies actually sit kind of in the middle of our organization's kind of framework or structural way of looking at things. So this is not an organizational chart, but it is a chart that kind of says where are the foundational pieces of the organization, where do governance policies sit. So in the context then, our organizational bylaws, sometimes they're still called constitution, whatever your governing documents are, they're usually provincially, federally, or state approved, so it depends on your jurisdiction and what kind of organization you are. But that's our governing documents, and they're usually called bylaws. Then we have framework policies, and what are those? Well, they're your vision, your mission, your values, your statements of belief, any of those kind of things that are actually, when we say framework, we really mean frame. You know, vision, mission, core values, statements of belief, any of those things. You don't have to have all of them, by the way. And I actually do have a lesson for you on a later module about how to create those and what they are. So that's the next piece of the kind of the foundational part. And then thirdly are the governance policies and the procedures or practices. Then following that are the operational policies. Those then belong to the paid senior managers of the organization who can create and who can change them. And by the way, most executive directors choose to share those policies, usually on a common drive electronically. We do not need to kill more trees. So we then share those electronically so that if any board member or the board as a whole is curious about what is an operating policy on, for example, human resources management or benefit administration or facility management or any of those things, they can actually go and look. That saves, by the way, a fair amount of time for both board members that are curious and for executive directors answering questions from board members. So transparency is a really good idea when it comes to operating policies. And then, as is the case with governance policies that have procedures below them, we have operating procedures. As you might imagine, the governance policy document is quite a bit shorter than operating policies, and it would depend on the size of your organization, but for the most part we're talking about organizations that have a need to have a fair amount of detail. So the policies and procedures or practices tend to be a fairly long document. All right, so let's look at then the areas that we need to be covering when it comes to governance policies. So under the framework side, we have bylaws, mission, vision, statements of belief, your target clients or participant or service users, whoever your customers or consumers are, and your geographic area served. So that's your frame. That's the biggest piece in the organization. These are usually created once in the early days of your organization and then reviewed and revised once every 5 years or so. It's a good idea to look at your bylaws. Some bylaws get pretty dated, and I've worked on probably 100 set of bylaws over the years, and some of them are pretty antiquated and really should have been looked at 30 or 40 years previously. Some bylaws aren't even in compliance any longer with changes in legislation or regulations that have happened within your jurisdiction. So pretty important that you take a look at those. So don't treat those as kind of the file it and forget it group. It's always good to review your vision and mission and who your target audience is and who your geographic area is. Some organizations that start off being just in a particular geographic city, town, community, municipality end up really spreading their wings and broadening that. And I'll just remind you, you can't do that without changing your framework document. So it's very important if you're going to change who you serve or change where you serve, then it's very important to change those pieces of your framework policies. Then we have our board policies. So those are our governance policies, board roles, responsibilities. This is going to sound familiar. Executive director duties, code of conduct, code of conduct and conflict of interest policy. So we'll talk more about this in a subsequent module. Handling complaints and grievances, how we develop policies and how we review policies, board meetings, board member attendance, succession planning, how we orient new board members and how we go about recruiting those people, committees, standing and ad hoc, strategic planning, reimbursement for expenses incurred by members of the board who are volunteers, board self-evaluation. So if you actually look at that, those topics probably sound pretty familiar. Those topics are actually the core of the Great Boards video course. So the stuff that I'm teaching you are actually almost identical to the stuff that's on that list that are your governance policies. Then our third policy area is association policies. So we have financial management, risk management and liability, compensation benefits, human resources policies, evaluating services and programs. And that list can be significantly longer depending on what types of services or what types of programs or business the organization is involved in. So this is a kind of a core list of 5 things, but there may be 15 or 20 things when you actually build out your operational policies. Then we have policies related to the board and executive director relationship. So when we're talking about this, we're saying, okay, this is a board governance policy document, but you remind yourself in the 3rd section that we're actually saying these are what the board will require management to put into place. So the board is in its own governance policy saying, here are the things that management has to have. It will probably have much more than this, but this is the minimum. Now in the 4th one, then they're saying, in our relationship with our executive director, these are the things that we want to talk about. So what authority do we delegate to the executive director? Go back to number 3 again, and you'll see the things we delegate are the things that we consider to be operational. So we are going to delegate management of facilities, management of finances, management of human resources, management of programs and services. So we're going to say very clearly what are the delegated authorities of the executive director. The executive director's reporting expectations by the board to the board. 3rd one is performance appraisal of the executive director. Tends to be a fairly long section because this is something we want to be fairly prescriptive about. We want to say probably 2 or 3 pages of kind of specific information on how the board will go about the business of performance appraisal. Remind yourself that the board is usually a group of volunteers without any human resources expertise. Now, boards sometimes have managers and supervisors on them, but they come often from the corporate world or educational or government kinds of worlds where the whole notion of performance appraisal can be quite different. And so we want to, because of board turnover, because we have healthy turnover on our board, we want to make sure we're very specific and very prescriptive in terms of how we go about the executive director's performance appraisal so that any board member right now and from 5 years from now, 10 years from now can pick that up and say, okay, I know what's expected of us as a board, and if I serve on the committee, I know what I'm expected to do in order to complete the executive director's performance appraisal. The next one is the executive director contract and compensation. I'll just give you a little tweak. Most new executive directors in the early part of this century are expecting contracts. Contracts are usually 1 year out the gate with 2- and 3-year extensions when you're satisfied with the executive director's performance. They specify compensation, they specify reasons for dismissal, they specify performance appraisal requirements, things like professional development and the budget attached to that. So all of those are part of what we'd expect to see in a contract. The contract itself can be an appendix to the policy, or it may not be there at all. The contract will be drawn up by a lawyer who practices employment law. So what you don't want to do is kind of make a run at it yourselves. Homemade contracts are usually pretty not worth the paper that they're written on. But the fact that you have to have a contract and that a contract will be offered to your executive director is a very important part of this. I know of many organizations now that have long-serving executive directors. A long-term client of mine who at 17 years of the executive director's tenure decided to create a contract, worked with a lawyer, and now has a 3-year renewable contract with their long-term executive director. I think it's good practice, and I think it really helps the idea of accountability of the board for making sure it's given the structures and left without any doubt, without any confusion, left the executive director communication and board communication very, very clear around all of the parts that relate to how the board will manage the executive director's employment inside the organization. Operational planning, so what's required of the staff by way of operational planning. By the way, operational planning should always be done after strategic planning is completed. If you do an annual update of your strategic plan, operational policy should follow that so that we have congruence between the things that are happening operationally and the things that are happening strategically. Board executive director communication, this will also be followed by what happens if the communication doesn't flow. Is there conflict between board? If there's a conflict between board and executive director, how do we resolve that? And then executive director succession planning. My last book was actually called Following the Leader, and it talks about succession planning for executive directors and for boards. And the whole idea behind that is that we need two types of succession planning for an executive director. Short term, we call it the hit by the bus scenario, and longer term, which is the planned exit of the executive director whenever she or he decides to exit the organization, and what that would look like and what the transition plan is. And retirement is another reason that the executive director might leave. And so it helps us in advance to know what the steps in the process, how much notice has to be given, how the recruitment for the new executive director will flow. Those kinds of things are a very important part of the kind of planned longer-term succession kind of planning. The fifth area of your governance policy document should be related to policies related to community relationships, relationships with media, public awareness and education, connecting with stakeholders, board, funder, and donor relationships. So these are important for a number of reasons. First of all, the board tends to default the funder and donor relationships to paid senior staff. The bigger the organization, the more likely that is to be the case. So this is essentially saying the board is going to have to figure out what is its role in that. There's a bit of a rule of thumb here, is that whenever we want to talk in a funder environment, for example, to our funder, paid staff from the organization, from the nonprofit, should talk to paid staff at the funder organization. And elected officials, meaning board members of the nonprofit, should speak to elected officials of your funder organization. And so this helps clarify. Let's suppose you're funded by a United Way for some of your funds. So paid staff, executive director, senior managers of your nonprofit talk to the executive director, senior managers of your United Way. But, or in addition to, your board of directors would speak to the board of directors of the United Way. So when the United Way has a funding event, when it has a big breakfast fundraising dinner, when it has a big breakfast event or a fundraising dinner, your board members should be present and should be prepared to have conversations with the board members of the United Way. So this should not just be staff members showing up at the fundraising breakfast. This should be board members. So those kinds of things are pretty important in the flow of communication, and it really is important to have your board very clear on what it is expected to do in the whole area of community relationships. The sixth area then is the whole area of sustainability. So requiring revenue diversification. This is critical. We do not often require this. We tend to get highly dependent on a small number of resources. And for viewers that are watching from Canada, which is where my home is, that we tend to rely on provincial and federal sources of funds, which become kind of they're our bread and butter, and we are highly vulnerable. In the US, there tends to be a lot more fundraising, a lot more private donor raised money, a lot more grant writing, a lot more contractual kinds of arrangements, and less reliance on state and federal governments for funding, although there is obviously some, as we often serve the citizens of our particular communities, and those citizens are citizens that are often paid for or supported by our various levels of government. But what we want to make sure here is that we begin the process of thinking strategically of how do we diversify revenues. An organization that has $3 million worth of revenue from one source is not a stable organization in any way, shape, or form. We might be fine this week, but with the stroke of a pen, with the change of government, even with the change of bureaucrats in government, our funding can be reduced, it can be completely compromised, it can be removed entirely. The tendering process that tends to go on lately of governments taking long-term contracts that some organizations have had for decades and re-tendering them out to other organizations in the community and making that same nonprofit that has had that money for a long time and delivered those services and sometimes has 10 or 100 staff delivering those services, all of a sudden is required to compete for. So we do the money that they have always received. So this doesn't go over very well, making sure that we find ways of creating revenue that is unencumbered. A wonderful book by Gene Block, by the way, called Show Me the Money, and another excellent book by Richard Steckel called Filthy Rich. So I'd recommend both of those to you. They're about social enterprise. They're about creating businesses that generate revenue that is unencumbered for your organization. Not for the faint of heart, but absolutely something that we need to look at more to. Requirement for cash reserves, we should be setting a policy that says we'll have X number of dollars of cash available. It can be invested, but it is liquid if we need it, and that guards against changes in funder priorities, changes in the way our money is returned to us. It guards against things like all of a sudden the check is simply late and we can't meet payroll because our $1 million check that usually comes, every week or every quarter is all of a sudden not there. The cash reserves become an absolutely critical part of that. Most organizations take a number of years to build their cash reserves. So don't expect if you need a $1 million cash reserve that will carry you for 6 months, that you would then have to be able to find that money right away. One of the ways of building cash reserves is any money that comes in by way of donations, a percentage of which would be always retained as a reserve. So if you get a $100 donation, $10 goes into the reserve. If you get a $1,000 donation, $100 goes into the reserve. And you'd be surprised, like your own agency organization spending a savings account that you'd never spend from, and this will be an absolutely excellent way of building those cash reserves over a period of years. The next one is operations from business enterprises. So many organizations run businesses as part of their operations. So how will that be managed? Is this two separate legal entities? Are they part of the same entity? How is it structured? Who manages it? Who is responsible for the operations and the accountability of the business enterprise? So very important that that be in the governance policies. And then finally, managing investments. This is the third largest sector in both Canada and the United States by way of gross revenues and by way of number of people employed. So this is a huge, huge, huge sector. And we need to think about ourselves as being business oriented in terms of how we manage those the investments that we have. Even if that's just the money that you have on hand from month to month that you will eventually use up, you still need to have it working for you and returning some revenue. So that's the end of this particular lesson, and I'll just remind you, please modify this list. This is a plain Jane basic list. Even if it took me 3 pages to get through it, it is a basic list, and you need to look at this and say, what do we need to add that are very specific to our organization that should be part of the governance policies for our organization? By the way, if you want a complimentary, completely free template, a sample, I have a wonderful sample from a client agency of mine who worked very hard on creating their governance policies. Again, some of it would be a good fit for you and some of it won't be, but fire me off an email to Paula MacLean at Learning for Leaders and I will send you a copy of that electronically, because the agency that has built this has kindly given permission for anyone to use it to support the creation of their governance policies. So make sure you drop me an email if you need to do that. That's the end of the lesson. See you in the next lesson.